the NRCS office, and they are both soil scientists. So take it away.
All right. Hi, my name is Nick Butler. I'm a soil scientist in the Dover Foxcroft Soil Survey Office. I've been doing soil survey work for about 15 years. And I've done numerous Envirothons. So today I'm going to present a video that was made specifically for Envirothons, distance learning by one of my coworkers out of New York. So the material is very, it was made just this year, so with a recent graduate right out of college. So the material is very new. It's even though it's out of New York, it's very focused on the Envirothon, so it should be pretty informative and be very helpful. Go ahead, Greg.
Oh, sure. My name is Granger. I'm a soil scientist with NRCS. And following the video, we're going to do a review of the review material for the soils section. Basically, we traditionally have our soils document, which everybody should have access to, which breaks down the properties that we feel are important for learning as part of the Envirothon process, along with the current issue soils part, which we didn't tie in this year, but we often do tie in some current issue questions to the test. So we're going to review the soils document basically in a PowerPoint form and give folks a chance to ask more in-depth questions about it. But basically all the questions should be able to be answered if the soils document has been studied and learned. And with that, I guess we're ready to show the video, Nick.
Hello everybody, welcome to the Erie County Envirothon 2021 Soil Section. My name is Zachary Warning. I'm a soil scientist working out of Belmont in Allegheny County, New York, but I actually grew up in Erie County, and I participated in the Erie County Envirothon for all 4 years of high school. That being said, I know what the mentality of my team was going into soils, that they were boring and difficult. That's why I never did soils, and why I didn't even take a class in soils until I was a junior in college. So let me be your assurance. Soils are the farthest thing from boring, and the challenge, though completely over-exaggerated, I assure you, only serves to make soils even more exciting. I'll be presenting this video in 10 segments, easily digestible that you can go back and revisit individually for help, and I will exclusively source test questions from these videos, but I'll include some extra fun books and videos and things at the end if you're curious. So to start, let's answer a very important and surprisingly misunderstood question. What exactly is soil? Part 1. What is soil? If you Google soil definition, the first result reads, the upper layer of earth in which plants grow, a black or dark brown material typically consisting of a mixture of organic remains, clay, and rock particles. It's a good start, but it just barely scratches the surface. For the purposes of the regional Envirothon, they define soil as the collection of natural bodies on the Earth's surface, in places modified or even made by man of earthly materials, containing living matter and supporting or capable of supporting plants out of doors. In my opinion, that's just too much jargon, and it doesn't touch on the most important aspects of soil. Wikipedia says soil is a mixture of organic matter, minerals, gases, liquids, and organisms that together support life. All of these functions, in their turn, modify the soil and its properties. That definition has an important distinction from the previous. It notes the role that soil plays in supporting all life, not just plants, and it begins to highlight what separates soil from dirt. Soil is alive, the living flesh of the earth, from which all terrestrial life comes and to which all terrestrial life will one day go. Soil is not just an ecosystem. It is the most biologically dense and abundant ecosystem on the planet, housing 1 out of every 4 species on Earth. In just 1 gram of healthy soil, you can find thousands of nematodes and protozoa representing hundreds of individual species, millions of fungi of about 5,000 different kinds, and billions of bacteria of about 10,000 individual species. In just one handful of soil, by sheer numbers alone, there are more living organisms than there are people on the planet. So for our purposes, here is a comprehensive definition of soil, building on those provided. Soil is the living sponge on the Earth's surface, comprised of a mixture of organic matter, minerals, gases, liquids, and organisms, which supports all living things. Soil has 3 main parts: minerals, pore space filled with air or water, and organic matter. Minerals typically take up about 45% of the volume. Air and water each take up 25%, and that last 5% is organic matter. By minerals, I mean sand, silt, and clay, in order from largest to smallest in size. A sand grain is easy to conceptualize. It's visible to the naked eye, and it ranges from about 2 millimeters down to just half a millimeter. Clay is the smallest, invisible to the naked eye, being any mineral particle that's less than 0.002 millimeters. Silt is any particle in between. When you figure out how much sand, silt, and clay you have, you know what we call the soil's texture. We'll get into texture more in another section. So how does this seemingly magical substance capable of transforming death into life, cleansing the air and water from toxins, and supporting the immense diversity of life here on Earth come to be? The process of soil formation has a name, pedogenesis, from Greek pedon, meaning soil, and genesis, meaning origin. There are 5 main factors that influence soil formation, following the acronym CROPT: climate, relief, organisms, parent material, and time. Climate refers to how much precipitation an area gets and what the average temperatures are like over long periods of time. Relief is the shape of the Earth's surface, such as mountains, hills, and plains, sometimes called topography. Organisms refers to the great abundance and diversity of life I referenced earlier, which work together to break any formerly living things down into food and nutrients for living things. Parent material describes the kinds of rocks or transported sediments that the soil formed in, whether it was deposited by a lake, called lacustrine, glacier, called glacial till or glacial outwash, river, called fluvial, gravity, colluvium, or wind, aeolian. And finally, time. The soils of Erie County are considered young to moderately old, only about 10 to 12,000 years old, and their properties reflect that. Other soils around the world are much older. To form just a single inch of usable topsoil, it takes about 500 years. So although constantly being made around the world, soil is functionally a non-renewable resource. The immense number of combinations of different climates, organisms, relief, parent materials, and time has produced a remarkably diverse set of soils on Earth, from the heaviest pottery clays to the coarsest beach sands. A large part of my job as a soil scientist is producing soil maps, charting where soils with different characteristics can be found. In fact, soils are so diverse, they have their own system of taxonomy, just like plants and animals, which we use to describe them. We won't get into soil taxonomy in this video series, but you should be aware that soils are extremely diverse and express a wide range of characteristics. Part 2. Why does soil matter? If you end up working with soils for your career, you'll have to answer this question a lot. Why does it matter? And regardless of whether soils end up the focus of your career as it is for me, everyone should be able to answer that question. Why? Farmer and poet Wendell Berry puts it best. The soil is the great connector of lives, the source and destination of all. It is the healer and restorer and resurrector by which disease passes into health, age into youth, death into life. Without proper care for it, we can have no community, because without proper care for it, we can have no life. No force on earth has toppled more civilizations than soil. Throughout history, their value was either misunderstood or taken entirely for granted. Untold billions of tons of healthy, rich land have washed away into the seas over the millennia, plowed to excess, robbed of their protective plant cover, or simply harvested until their last nutrients were consumed and never returned.
Today, 1/3 of the farmable land on Earth can no longer produce food. Food insecurity grows, and in the face of climate change, many scientists have realized soil is our greatest and perhaps last hope for a sustainable future. As Ratan Lal said at the 54th Nobel Conference, linked at the end of this video series, the degradation of soil is as great a threat to global peace and security as, quote, ICBMs and nuclear proliferation. Even today in America, the problem is far worse than it appears, with intensive fertilization, tillage, and imported organic matter hiding the true extent of the degradation of our soils.
That may sound depressing, but soils offer us a silver lining. Healthy soils cleanse the air and water, produce untold amounts of plant matter, cycle and store essential atmospheric gases, and outside of the oceans, they serve as the second biggest greenhouse gas sink in the world. Many climate scientists have come to the realization that without soils, we cannot overcome our climate crisis. But with soils, we can not only mitigate but reverse the damage we've done to this planet. If you're interested in learning more about that, check out the videos I'll throw in at the end.
Part 3. Soil characteristics.
Now that we've established what soil is and why it matters, let's talk about the essential characteristics of soil. As I mentioned in a previous section, your typical soil is about 45% minerals, half pore space filled with a mix of air and water, and 5% organic matter. Let's start with that mineral section. In the field, soil scientists like myself will estimate the relative proportion of sand, silt, and clay, or the texture of a soil, by rubbing it between our thumb and fingers when it's moist. If it's gritty, it's likely got a lot of sand. Soft and flowery, likely very silty. Pliable and moldable, it's likely got a lot of clay. We estimate the percent of each, and then look to the soil textural triangle.
This chart is easy to use and very helpful. For example, let's say I have a soil which I've determined has 20% clay, 40% silt, and 40% sand. By following the lines printed on the textural triangle, we find a label at the point where the three lines meet, telling us that our soil is a loam. Loam is what we call a soil with a similar influence of sand, silt, and clay, as just a little clay can have a very large influence on soil. Practice on your own coming up with random proportions of sand, silt, and clay, and see what texture you end up with. The names may seem confusing, and I remember my group members baffled at the idea that a loamy sand and a sandy loam were actually different. Simply put, a loamy sand has more sand, and a sandy loam has more loam.
So now we're going to touch on the pore space. So when I first gave that definition of soil, I said it's like a living sponge. And that's a good analogy because just like this sponge here, it appears solid, but a large percent of this is pore space or empty space. Just as in a healthy soil, about 50% is pore space. So just like the sponge here, soils have different sizes of pores. There's macropores, which are large pores that water is going to flow through, and there's micropores that water will enter, but the micropores will hold that water against gravity. So that's essential for plants when they need water in drier times. And when it rains and the water moves through the macropores and drains out of them due to gravity, then you get this balance of the 25% air, 25% water, where the macropores are going to hold your air and the micropores are going to hold your water. And that's essential for soil life. A healthy soil has a good mix of macropores and micropores. And when you've got a decent amount of macropores, the soil, it has good percolation, so water moves through it very easily. And when you till or compact a soil, you actually reduce what we call the permeability or the ease of water entering the system. So I'm going to demonstrate that with this sponge. I've got some water in this tub here. And when you take the sponge, which we're going to assume is our soil, and you soak it up, this is when it's raining. The rain is filling in all of the pores. And when I lift this sponge out of the water, that is going to simulate gravity pulling the water out of the macropores. So once this sponge has drained out of all of its macropores, this excess water, that would be, in soil terms, what we would call field capacity. Field capacity is when a soil is moist, but all of the water that cannot be held against gravity is drained out. But what's amazing about soil is that you can see it looks like it's pretty much finishing up draining out, but look how much water is held against gravity by micropores. Far more water than macropores, really.
And that is what is so important for plants keeping moisture during dry times. One of the most visually striking differences between soils is color. Many soils are black or brown, as the Google definition said, but soils can also be red, white, gray, orange, yellow, green, and even pink or purple. So here I have a resource that soil scientists use to categorize the color of a soil in the field. This is called the Munsell Soil Color Book. And we use three main variables to determine the color of a soil: hue, value, and chroma. The hue is indicated by these tabs, starting with 5R, which R stands for red, and moving into the YRs for yellow-red. Eventually down in here we get to Y for yellow. And then these last four tabs are gley or gray, and that's for soils that are particularly white or gray, very pale. So the hue is just how red, yellow, green, purple a soil is. The value is how light or dark the soil is. And the chroma indicates the intensity or the strength of the color. So around here in New York, we're actually going to use 7.5 YR very commonly, as well as 10 YR, which is the page immediately following, and even into a little bit of 2.5 Y, because our soils in New York here are yellow and red shades of brown, usually. And once we've decided on a hue, value, and chroma, let's say 2.5 Y 5.1, we'll notate it just like that. 2.5 Y 5.1 shows us that it's gray. Another visually striking characteristic of soil is its structure. Soil structure is the way individual particles of sand, silt, and clay are assembled. When many single particles assemble thanks to roots, fungi, and the natural glues, such as the kinds earthworms produce, they form what we call an aggregate. So a healthy soil at the surface should have these visible aggregates. It's called granular structure, and they look sort of like breadcrumbs. A good comparison might be cottage cheese, and these are being held together as they break apart. They break apart into these chunks. And that's because they're held together by these biotic glues and even roots. And these are essential for soil health because macropores and micropores are found between and among soil aggregates. So if you don't have any structure, like if you plow a soil or till a soil and destroy all these aggregates, you will lose your pore space, and air and water will have a much harder time moving through the soil, and your soil will be much more susceptible to erosion. There's all sorts of soil structures. There's from granular to columnar, things like that. But for our purposes, you should be familiar with just a few main types. Definitely granular. Granular structure is the surface structure in the A horizon of any healthy soil, and even some pretty degraded soils in New York State. And you should also be familiar with blocky structure. If you go into the B horizon, you're going to find blocky structure very commonly in New York soils. And the last one that you should be familiar with is massive structure, which essentially means structureless. And that's what you're going to find naturally in the environment in the C horizon, the weathered parent material. But you can also find what looks essentially like massive structure in heavily compacted, heavily tilled surface soil. So that's a sign of an unhealthy soil, because when you get the massive structure and you've lost all your pores, your macropores especially, you end up producing a soil that is very difficult for water to enter into and for air to move through, and you'll see the results in the plants that you grow in that soil. So finally, we're going to touch on pH. Soil scientists like myself will use pH kits like this in the field to get a quick assessment of pH right there on the location. So we'll use this little tray. You put soil into these large dishes, just a little bit, and then we add chemicals that turn certain colors based on the pH, and we read these charts to assess what we think is the closest match. pH is very important for soil health, as if your pH is around neutral, plants have the best access to the macro and micronutrients that they need for growth.
Many plants have adapted to acidic or basic conditions, but near neutral, especially for crops, is about what you're going to want. And in New York, our soils generally range from about a pH of 5 to a pH of 8. So using the characteristics that we described earlier, we describe what we call soil horizons. And many horizons, it is the case that they visually look very different in terms of color. But it's also the case many times that the color might be very similar, but the texture is different, or the pH is different, or the structure is different. And in that case, we're going to have to look at those other characteristics that we've described to differentiate the horizons. We differentiate horizons using capital letters.
The major horizons you should know are O, A, E, B, C, and R, although no soil is guaranteed to have all of these horizons. The O layer is the litter layer, often very thin and not usually present in agricultural soils. The A horizon is where agricultural soils begin, and it represents the topsoil, where the soil organic matter is found. The E horizon, common in forest stands dominated by evergreens, is a thin, usually chalky white or gray layer in the soil, showing where nutrients have been leached out or eluviated, thanks to the soil being quite acidic. The B horizon represents the subsoil, and the C horizon is the weathered parent material. R designates where bedrock is found. Many soils do not have bedrock near the surface, and so do not have an R horizon. Soil horizons often have a small letter placed near them, such as capital A lowercase p, to indicate a specific attribute of that horizon. In the case of AP, the most common type of A horizon for agricultural soils, the P simply means the soil was plowed. Once we've described and designated the horizons of a soil, we have what we call a pedon description, with a pedon being the smallest observable unit of a soil. Pedon descriptions are the basis of our soil series descriptions, with a series being the soil's equivalent of a species. Part 4. Reading the landscape. Next time you're out walking in the woods, observe the shape of the ground. Is it flat or sloped? Is the slope like a bowl, concave, or like an upside-down bowl, convex? If it is flat, are you near a water source, such as a river or a creek? Is the ground wet? If it is on a slope, how steep? Is the ground dry? How do the plants change when you go from one type of landscape to another? Do you see any bedrock sticking out? These are the questions soil scientists ask all the time in the field. Knowing where you are on the landscape is a critical part of knowing the soils, and it can tell you a lot about them before you even dig a hole. In general, convex slopes tend to shed water, which makes them drier. Concave slopes tend to collect water, so they're usually wetter. Valleys tend to have creeks or streams running through them, and the shoulders or slopes right near the hilltop tend to have bedrock sticking out near the surface. Broad, flat hilltops tend to be wet. All soils have what we call a drainage class. This ranges from excessively well drained to hydric. Drainage class refers to how high the seasonal water table is in the soil, and how well a soil holds on to water that enters it. We can tell where the seasonal high water table is by looking at the rust-colored and gray discolorations in the soil, called redoxymorphic features, created by the oxidation and reduction of iron and manganese. Hydric soils have unique properties and protections under the law, as many of them qualify as wetlands. In order to meet the definition of a hydric soil, it must be sufficiently wet in the upper part to develop anaerobic, or oxygen-free, conditions during the growing season. Hydric soils are unique because without oxygen to accelerate decomposition, they build up much more organic matter than drier soils. Hydric soils, and wetlands by extension, must be drained in order to be farmed. When drained, they're some of the most productive soils we have, referred to as black gold. However, undrained, they serve as carbon sinks, filter out pollutants from water and air, and serve as habitat for rare and unique species. Hydric soils are best used economically by keeping them as they are, as their environmental benefits in the form of wetlands far outweigh the potential profits from draining and farming them. Hence, current laws prohibit the draining of wetlands unless a new wetland is put elsewhere to replace the valuable and vulnerable habitat. Before even getting out into the field, soil scientists look at topographic maps to get a sense of what the topography or relief will be like. Each line indicates an elevation, so lines close together represent steep slopes, and spaced lines represent gradual slopes. When topographic lines converge to points and valleys, the point shows you the direction water is flowing. By using the north arrow to orient our maps, we know which slope faces which direction. South-facing slopes tend to be drier, and north-facing slopes tend to be wetter because of differing amounts of sunlight hitting them. All of this information allows us to focus our expectations for what the soil in a particular area will be like. Slope is one of the most important factors for determining what a soil will be like. In the field, we use a tool known as the clinometer to determine slope. So here we have the clinometer, and when you're going to use this in the field, you take this end here with the little eye hole, and you're going to put that up to your eye, and you're actually going to keep both eyes open, and these numbers will appear in your vision, and you're going to read the numbers on the right side. But keeping the other eye open, you're going to focus on an object that's down slope from you or up slope, that you know to be at the same height as your eye level, and that will allow you to assess the slope. Reading the numbers on the right side of your vision will tell you what the slope is. Part 5. Soil Survey. So a soil survey is a detailed report on the soils of an area, and it's got maps with soil map unit boundaries, pictures, descriptions, tables of soil properties and features, and they're mainly used by farmers, especially real estate agents, engineers, land use planners, and anyone who desires information about the soil resource. And there's actually a helpful glossary at the back that has all sorts of soil terminology if the descriptions that you find in the soil survey book are a bit confusing. So here we have the soil survey for Erie County, and it's big, but don't be intimidated by the size, because this back half is actually all soil maps. So these soil maps show soil map units, and the soil map units are basically polygons showing the local distribution of a soil of a particular kind. So just where that soil is occurring on the landscape. And we use special symbols to notate them. In the case of this book that I have, which is an older copy of the Erie County Soil Survey, they use letters, but many, especially modern surveys, will use numbers. Either way, it's just a symbol to tell you what the soil series is. And as I said in an earlier section, a soil series is sort of the soil's equivalent of a species. So when you see the notation with the symbol, let's say, for example, the state soil of New York, which can be found in Erie County, it's called Honeoye Loam. In Erie County, the survey that I have here right in front of me, it's symbolized HO. And then following the symbol, you'll find a letter A through F. And A through F just indicates the slope, because slope is one of the most important characteristics for what you're going to be able to do with that soil. So we find Honeoye on slopes from 0 to 8%. So we have symbols for HOA, A slope being 0 to 3%, and HOB, B slope being 3 to 8%. Slopes go all the way up to F, as I said, so the delineations for the slope are A, 0 to 3, B, 3 to 8, C, 8 to 15, D, 15 to 25, E, 25 to 35, and F slope is anything in excess of 35% slopes. So we don't really want to farm any soil that is over a C slope. Once you get into that range, into that 20, 30, 40, 50, it becomes very limited what you can do with the soil. So if you want to see what soils are present where you live, you can open up in this book to the initial map page, which is going to have, first of all, some good information about the geology and the age of the soils and their characteristics. But the more important page that you're going to want to look at in this is right here. This is Erie County, and there's a grid overlaid showing which map page is over which area. So if you can find generally where your school is or your home, you go to that map page. Then you'll find whatever soil symbol is over where the area that you're looking at. And then you can go into this earlier part of the legend and look up what that symbol means. If it's HO, for example, if it was HOA, that's honey oil loam. So if we go to the honey oil loam page, you can see here it says HOA, honey oil loam, 0 to 3% slopes. Might be a little difficult to see. But it gives you a good description of the soil, the common characteristics, and it tells you their common uses. So the soil survey is an extremely valuable resource for learning about soils of a particular area, and it will tell you especially interpretations for the soil. So if you really want to know what you can do on your land, that's one of the first things that you should do if you get a new home or you're on a new property. Find the soil survey for that area and look into the properties of your soils, and you'll be surprised what they can and cannot do.
All soil surveys can be found online by searching for the NRCS Soil Survey application, Web Soil Survey. On the home page, in the left-hand column, there's a tab for Archived Soil Surveys. Select New York, and then scroll down to find Erie County. There you will notice that the current survey does not exist in paper form at all. Rather, it's found in the database. To see the most recent survey for yourself, click the green button on the home page labeled Start WSS. Then, under Soil Survey Area, select New York and Erie County. Then, click Set AOI, meaning Area of Interest. Then, near the top of the page, select the Soil Map tab, and there you go. If you want to focus on a particular area, such as your home or school, in the Area of Interest tab, type in the address under the Quick Navigation tab. All the soils data collected and maps created by soil scientists are available to the public via WSS for free. Part 6. Soil Interpretations. So how do we take all of these characteristics and properties and turn them into something practical and usable by landowners? That's where soil interpretations come in. Soil interpretations evaluate or predict how suited or limited a particular soil is for a particular use, or what the potential response of a soil could be. Interpretations are applied for uses from agriculture to forestry to development. The USDA puts soil series into designated land use classifications, such as prime farmland if drained, or not prime farmland. The example series used in a previous segment, honey oil loam, is designated as prime farmland. Interpretations are key for making soil survey data useful to businesses and producers, and they're the main reason that we map where different soils occur. They're built on cutting-edge science and research, and thoroughly reviewed and tested before being recommended to the public, as we want to make sure that people have the best possible information before making use and management decisions. Interpretations for the soils of Erie County can be found in the Erie County Soil Survey. Part 7. Threats to soil. The day Congress met to hear the speech of Hugh Hammond Bennett, the father of soil conservation, pleading with the legislature to create a permanent soil conservation service, the sky over Washington, D.C. was dark, shrouded in the dusty remains of the rich topsoil of the plains. The urgency of his message was felt, and on April 27, 1935, what we today call the NRCS was created. Erosion is in the same vein as climate change, in that it is an issue which proceeds slowly on a day-to-day basis, making it difficult to notice in the short term, and yet when the collective results of decades of neglect appear, they are overwhelming in scale and detrimental in effect. There are two main types of erosion: wind and water. In New York, wind erosion only has a significant effect on our soils with very high amounts of organic matter, such as drained hydric soils. Water erosion takes three main forms: sheet, rill, and gully erosion. Sheet erosion occurs on hill slopes when a thin layer of topsoil is removed over a whole field or hillside and may not be readily noticed. Rill erosion is when runoff forms small channels as it concentrates down a slope. If the rills become deeper than 0.3 meters, it is referred to as gully erosion. The cost of soil erosion is nearly $45 billion annually, with $100 million of farm income lost every year. On average across the country, for every pound of produce we make, we lose 6 pounds of soil to erosion, and annually in the United States, we lose soil 18 times faster than it is being made.
Around the world, especially in places without agencies like the NRCS, the number is much higher, on the order of 20 to 30 pounds of soil lost per pound of food grown. In just 250 years, the time it takes to make half an inch of fertile soil, 50% of America's original topsoil has been washed away. That eroded soil must go somewhere, and so the flip side of erosion is sedimentation, a process which can fill in rivers and damage infrastructure around the world. Multiple measures are taken across the country to reduce erosion. Using cover crops in the off-season provides vegetative cover to protect the soil from the surprisingly powerful impact of raindrops, holding the soil together with living roots. Minimizing tillage practices allows soil structure to build without interruption, creating larger and more stable aggregates capable of absorbing heavy rainfalls without washing away. Avoiding plantings on steep slopes and keeping crop rows perpendicular to the direction of slope also helps to prevent the formation of rills and gullies. Hedgerows and windbreaks in the form of permanent standing vegetation, as well as proper irrigation, can mitigate wind erosion on those drained hydric soils. In forestry practices, harvesting only in dry or snow-packed conditions prevents the formation of ruts from heavy machinery, which can last from decades to centuries. Part 8. Soil Health. A comprehensive understanding of soil begins with thinking of the soil as an ecosystem. When we harvest food, fuel, and fiber from it, we are really harvesting the energy and byproducts of billions of soil microorganisms which call the soil their home. In thinking of the soil this way, it becomes clear that our focus should not solely be on the crop, but also the resource from which the crop is born. The interaction must be reciprocal, with us replenishing the energy and nutrients we take, or else the system becomes unsustainable. When we harvest crops and leave the fields barren for months, we are essentially removing the habitat of the soil microorganisms, reducing their abundance, diversity, and health as a result. In addition, without the protection of the vegetation, the soil loses its stability, undergoing wild fluctuations in temperature and moisture, freezing, scorching, drying, and drowning what few organisms remain. Our agricultural fields, once richly diverse with bacteria, protozoa, fungi, and invertebrates, are left dominated by the rapidly reproducing bacteria specialized for our small number of crop species. Without the complex relationship of thousands, if not millions, of organisms over long periods of time, the soil loses its functionality, and our harvests dwindle, both in quality and quantity. And so the most fundamental principle of soil health is keeping the ground covered, ideally with living plants. Even better, a diverse cover of plants. Barren land and monocultures are nearly non-existent in nature. Plowing should never be practiced, and tillage should be minimized as much as possible, if not eliminated entirely. Proper nutrient, manure, and pest management is key to ensuring the plants are healthy, and that the nutrients are not lost to streams in runoff, although a diverse cover of plants takes care of most of this on its own. Wherever possible, integrate crops with animals, as in the natural soil system, plants and animals work together to keep the system healthy. The goal, in essence, is to mimic the natural system from which the soil was born, and which healthy soil serves to maintain.
An unhealthy soil is easy to diagnose, if you know what you're looking for. From the moment you start digging your pit, the soil is tough and compacted. The roots are often sparse and stunted, running laterally along planes of compressed soil material. The plants appear wilted or unusually small, and being more subjected to disease, they show the common signs of distress, drought, and nutrient deficiencies. The soil itself is often structureless, with little to no pores for air and water to move through, and creatures like earthworms and other invertebrates nowhere to be found. The surface layers, once richly dark with organic matter from the continued recycling of dead plants and litter, are left pale and dry, regardless of how much rain has fallen. Neglected for too long, and a soil environment which once housed a cornucopia of species from all kingdoms of life will be left looking, for lack of a better word, like dirt. Barren, dry, and utterly lifeless.
There are a lot of visually striking demonstrations we can use to show the difference between a healthy and an unhealthy soil. So here you see a soil from a pasture that has not been tilled in 20 years. and you can see how much visibly darker it is than this soil of the same texture, which is far lower in organic matter, much more pale. And this is called a slake test. So these two graduated cylinders have these mesh nets in them, and we're gonna see what happens when I just set these aggregates inside standing water. So we'll start with a healthy soil, like a sponge. You can see it's not doing anything, not breaking apart. It's allowing the water to enter into the pores. But let's see what happens with the unhealthy soil. It is destroyed, as without any of that biotic activity, none of those biotic glues to hold those pores and those aggregates together, the water rushing into the pores destroys the soil. This is why erosion is so bad on heavily tilled soils. They can't hold together against the force of even standing water, let alone the force of raindrops. The difference speaks for itself. The second demonstration will be presented by NRCS employee Ray Archuleta in a short video segment.
I want to show you how soil disturbance through tillage impacts soil function. Here are two soils. This soil has been disturbed by conventional tillage. This soil has not been tilled for 40 years. It's virtually undisturbed. Watch what happens when I simulate rainfall on these two soils. The undisturbed soil allows every precious inch to infiltrate. This is good for your production and for the environment. The disturbed soil does not allow the water to infiltrate. Most of the water is going to run off. Place your soil into drought mode and put your nutrients into the nearest lake. When it comes to building healthy, productive soils, remember, do not disturb.
Part 9, Summary and Objectives. So after watching these videos, what should you know? What should you be able to do? You should be able to provide a good, comprehensive definition of soil. Also, be able to describe why soils are important and what benefits they provide people and the environment. You should also be able to define parent material and give an example, such as lacustrine, fluvial, or aeolian. In addition, be able to list the 5 soil forming factors: cropped, climate, relief, organisms, parent material, and time. Be aware of and able to describe what soil is generally comprised of, what soil texture is, and how to determine the texture of a soil on the textural triangle, what structure is, how to use a clinometer to find slope, and the difference between concave and convex, and what that slope shape tells you about the movement of water, how to use the Munsell Soil Color Book, what the importance of soil pH is, what the major horizons of a soil profile are, and how we determine the drainage class of a soil. Next, know what a soil series is and how to use it. Understand how to interpret a map symbol and how to know what slope class it's in. Be aware of soil surveys and what their use is, as well as who uses them. Know how to define a soil interpretation and give an example of a USDA land use classification, such as prime farmland. Be able to define erosion and sedimentation. Identify and describe the different types of erosion: wind, water, sheet, rill, and gully. The economic impacts of erosion, and an example of a practice used to mitigate erosion, both in an agricultural setting as well as a non-agricultural setting. Know the definition of a hydric soil, what its characteristics are, how they're used, and what their economic value is. Finally, give examples of how to identify a healthy versus unhealthy soil, and give examples for how to maintain or improve the health of a particular soil. If you have a handle on the major concepts and ideas presented here, you will be on your way to success in the soil section of Envirothon.
All right, thanks, Nick, for putting that on for us. That's a very informative video that goes a little bit more in depth on certain things than the test will, but it's all good information for people interested in Envirothon to learn about soils. Are there any questions about anything you saw so far that you'd like to ask at this point?
I have a question.
Yep.
The video is very good. And like when we look at that, the soil, the main soil document, and you said you were going to talk about that coming up.
Yep.
Some of the things they did have some little differences, like they talked about fluvial soils, which I think in the main soil document, we think about it as being alluvial soil.
That's correct. Yep.
So would it be fair to say that when we're looking at those kinds of things, that the terminology in the main soil document would be the most important part to do?
Absolutely. The main soils document is the test. Everything in the test is in the main soils document, except for the interpretation section, which we'll get into a little bit, but that is information from soils interpretations from Web Soil Survey that are provided like a subset for 5 different soil map units that are provided as part of the test. So you just refer to the subset that'll be included with the test.
Also, so he talked about the using the soil report with the maps and looking up the soil series there.
Yep.
But in the last few years in Maine, we've been really focused on Web Soil Survey, so we should continue to focus on that rather than try to track down those kinds of documents.
Absolutely. Those documents are no longer the official soil survey. And the soil survey, which Nick is in charge of in most of Maine, is a constantly updated material. And so that old static document book, which we haven't produced one in Maine, I don't think, since 2006, that has been published hard copy. So that document's no longer the official source of data. It still has good data in it, but Web Soil Survey is the source we recommend and the source we use for our official soils data. And that's what, well, as I mentioned, the interpretation section will be a subset of information from Web Soil Survey that will be provided. Anything else? All right. We'll move on to the PowerPoint. There we go. So as I mentioned before, the test in its traditional form is made up of the soils document information and a subset of information about soils related to the current issue. The current issue will not be incorporated into this year's Envirothon test. However, it probably will be incorporated into next year's. But this document contains all the information that the test is derived from. The traditional test, regional test, had the 4 sections. The soil judging scorecard was an important part, and that's where you would sit in a soils pit and evaluate things like presence or absence of horizons, soil color, soil texture, slope of the land, stoniness of the surface of the land, and such. It's just too difficult to do virtually, so there won't be a soils judging scorecard this year. However, there will be in the future. So the test is pretty much made up of the general soils questions and the soils property interpretation questions. And most of this presentation is going to be related to the soils properties. So as I mentioned in the video that we just watched, there are 4 components of soils: the mineral, the air, the water, and the organic matter. He referred to the air and water as kind of the spot that fills the voids. And so the percentages of such changes depending on how wet the field is at the time. Organic matter also varies. 5% a high end of the average. In heavily cropped areas, it may be down around 2 or 3. In bogs and such, it's much, much higher. Air is rather obvious, but it is more available in uncompacted soil material. And it's something that the roots can use to breathe, the microbes in the soil can use to breathe, and it's much less available in compacted soils. Water is also obvious what water is. Soil water contains nutrients dissolved that can be taken up by plants. And so having the ability for water to be held in the soil is beneficial. Certain components like organic matter will help enhance the ability of the soil to keep water in it. Soil organic matter is basically decomposing or decomposed carbon-based tissue, living tissue. Generally, as it breaks down, it changes its abilities to hold water and hold nutrients, and it also helps hold the mineral component together into the structural units. So soil organic matter is a real good thing to try and enhance in the soil. Soil organisms, the microorganisms feed off the organic matter. The microorganisms also help enhance the pore space for the air and the water. They turn the soil to a certain extent within. The macroorganisms are the bigger things like groundhogs and moles, and the microorganisms are your bacteria, your fungi, and such. The video mentioned the factors influencing soil formation. You have climate, topography, biota, time, and parent materials. And time is generally fairly similar across Maine. but we have great variation in topography, biota, parent materials, and even climate between northwestern Maine and southwestern Maine. The climate determines the amount of freezing and thawing of the soil, along with rainfall, which contributes, of course, to erosion, but also can leach nutrients out with excessive rain. The topography is the slope of the land, and that's something the video is mentioned about measuring with a clinometer. Measuring the slope of the land with the clinometer is something that we traditionally did at the soil judging station. But the aspect and the slope affect the soils in the landscape. The steeper the slope, generally the drier the site will be, so the drier the soils will be. And the direction of the slope will impact the amount of sunlight. It also will impact the amount of freezing and thawing, as the north slopes generally don't get as much warm sun in the spring. So you'll have less freezing and thawing. Well, you'll have less thawing anyhow in those environments. The living organisms are very active in the processes, and they can even reduce the chemicals in the soil, which was mentioned as part of redoxamorphic action. And basically, the soil microorganisms are taking electrons from certain minerals, which changes their state from solid to liquid and moves things around. In Maine, time is somewhere around 10 to 12,000 years since the last glaciation. That's different from many parts of this world where it's been much, much longer since any kind of glacial action. Glacial action is not the driver of soil development in places closer to the equator, but certainly in Maine, the glaciers had a huge impact on how the soils are laid across the landscape, and also impacted the parent material, how things are laid down. The 6 common parent materials in Maine are listed here, with organic, glacial till, outwash, lacustrine sediments, marine sediments, and alluvial soils. And glacial till has 2 components as well, but we'll start with the organic. Organic soils have thick layers on the surface of breaking down plant material. And in cool and wet environments like swamps, you'll wind up with anywhere from 8 inches to several feet of organic matter on the surface before you run into any mineral soil. And that can also happen up in high elevations or cool coastal climates. If you go out on the islands of Maine, you'll see that you'll often see areas that have virtually no mineral soil. There's a large accumulation of organic matter, and then a small layer of mineral soil, and then you're right on to bedrock. So those soils are considered organic because there's much more organic matter over the bedrock than there is mineral soil. For glacial till, it's the most common parent material in Maine. Most of your hills away from the coast are made up of glacial till. And basically, glacial till is glacial deposits that are unsorted. So you have a mix of sand, silt, clay, and rocks. And generally, they can be compacted. So the 2 types of glacial till being lodgement till and ablation till. Lodgement till is that compacted soil that exists usually within 2 feet of the topsoil, and it's very hard, natural hard pan. Ablation till is far less common. but it's again unsorted material with rock and mineral that generally doesn't have that hard pan. And the hard pan forms from the mile of ice that was over the top of Maine during the last glaciation, which was very heavy and compacted all the soil as hard as the hard pan is in a lodgement till. And in over the 10,000 years, lodgement till has weathered away to being looser in the upper part through freezing and thawing and root action and microorganisms and macroorganisms turning the soil. Outwash is basically sorted sand and gravels. Gravel pits are in outwash generally. It is water that, material that was moved by water. When you have fast moving water, you generally will drop out larger soil components, and the larger soil components being sands and rocks. When you have slow moving water, your silts and clays will drop out, but fast moving waters, they tend to stay suspended. So where you've had fast moving water in the past, perhaps a river within the glacier, you'll wind up with the outwash being deposited below them. Lacustrine sediments are lake bottom sediments. And so it can be from a glacial lake, which was a lake formed within the ice as the ice was melting, and that caused the water to slow down and deposit. And that's why you'll have silts and clays in the bottom of many of these lakes and lacustrine sediments. You can also wind up with very fine sand deposits. But generally, there's no rocks that are in the soil profile in most lacustrine settings. With the marine sediments, it's the same idea. However, it is, instead of being materials being dropped out of standing water like you would have in a lake, you have materials dropping out of the ocean. So upon the recession of the last glacier, the ground was compressed and the ocean came inland. And that's why you have marine sediments formed. They aren't all that different from the mud flats that you have off the coast, except they've been out of the ocean a while and have undergone soil profile development or petagenesis. They tend to be mostly silts and clays, and again, very few rock fragments. With alluvial soils, they're formed along floodplains. We have some areas that tend to be sandier and some areas that tend to be siltier in our floodplains in Maine, and that's generally related to what's upslope in the parent materials. But the sandier materials tend to be in western Maine. And alluvial soils are disturbed by flooding enough that they don't tend to develop a traditional soil profile. In other words, an A horizon, a B horizon, a C horizon. It may go an A horizon, then a C horizon, then an A horizon, then a C horizon. And that's from additional events post-glacial where material has been deposited on the soil surface. So the four processes of soil formation are transformations, translocations, additions, and losses. Transformations are the soil changing chemically and physically. The translocations are materials moving within the soil up and down. Additions are generally things such as organic matter to the surface, and losses are caused generally by leaching. And so we've got a diagram here that shows those processes. Losses generally are deposited downslope. Translocations tend to move out of the system. Transformations tend to stay in the system. So soil horizons, as I mentioned before, with the A and the C, are soil layers that have slightly different properties. They are part of the soil forming process, and they vary by texture, consistence, organic matter, deposition, and content, and things of that nature. As the video mentioned, you have the O, the A, the E, the B, the C, and the R that you may have. You'll rarely see a soil that has all of those, but a main soil may have any of those. And that's traditionally a question that we would ask on the soil judging portion for presence or absence of a horizon. So for the O horizon, that's accumulation of organic matter, whether it be from wetness or just cold environments. The organic matter will oxidize and break down in warmer environments. Therefore, you will have less of a layer built up, and organisms can reduce it as well by consuming it. Organic horizons or O horizons are in forests, but generally not in fields. If they are in fields, it would be grasslands, pastures, and such, and it would be a lot thinner layer than you would find in a forest environment. For the A horizon, it is the topsoil. Generally, it has been influenced by agricultural activity through either tillage or through pasturing. You'll wind up with a layer of soil that is darker brown in color. It's generally a combination of the O and the E horizons, which I'll talk about in a second, that have been mixed through, as I said, either agricultural activity from plowing or pasturing. With the E horizon, it is an area that has undergone chemical changes through intense leaching. It's almost exclusively found in forested areas, and it happens through chemical reactions which are more commonly occurring in acidic areas, which is why it's more commonly occurring in softwood forests. The E horizon is generally whitish gray, and it's discontinuous. In other words, it may be an inch thick and then not at all present, and it may wind up reoccurring at 4 inches thick within 10 feet. It is highly variable in how it's laid down. The B horizon is below that. The B horizon is slightly weathered. It is certainly not as weathered or formed or undergone as much soil formation as the B horizon. It is generally yellowish or reddish brown in color in upland conditions. However, it tends to be gray to olive in wetter conditions. It has formed soil structure, and roots can penetrate it. The C horizon is generally unweathered parent material. As I mentioned before, the soil was rather homogeneous and certainly in lodgement till after the glaciation. And the C horizon is very close to what it looked like when it first was observed after the glaciers receded. There may be more than one C horizon depending on what had happened traditionally between the glacial events, but usually you have one type of C horizon, and it's usually olive in color. And the R is the bedrock. So the R horizon may be hard granitic bedrock, or it could be soft sedimentary bedrock. It all comprises the R horizon and is hard like a rock and not necessarily similar to the mineral soil of the C horizon. So here we've got some soil profiles shown, and you can see in the one on the left we have an organic horizon on the top, followed by an E horizon, and then which would be the whitish gray layer. And then we have a reddish brown layer, which would be the B horizon, and that extends down to about the 12-inch layer. And then going down to from somewhere between 12 and 16 down to 28 would be the C horizon. And then you have bedrock below that, and you can see the bedrock in the picture. In the picture on the right, you again have organic matter on the surface, a discontinuous E horizon. You can see it present to the right of the tape, but it's not present to the left. A fairly thick reddish yellowish brown B horizon, and then an olive C horizon for the remainder of the depth. Here we've got for reference, the first one we looked at was fairly common of a lodgement till, as well as the second one. The third one looks to be a sedimentary deposit. We have a thick agricultural A horizon that extends to around 12 inches, just below 12 inches. You don't see the organic matter on the surface. We've got a yellowish reddish brown. Certainly the yellowish reddish is far more common on the left, but that whole area between the Gulf tee just above the 12 and just below the 20 would be your B horizon. And then your C horizon, you're into the olive. And again, that's impacted by agriculture. So you have no significant O horizon. It may be a little bit of duff in that grass, but there's really no O horizon. So here you would have an A horizon present, a B horizon present, and a C horizon present. In the picture on the right, we have a horizon, which would be down to about 8 inches. And then we get into a B horizon down to about 20 inches, and the C horizon below that. And you can see some rocks within the profile to the right of the tape in the shade a little bit there. The soil properties that we would look at commonly are texture, structure, consistence, depth, and drainage class. Texture is the combination of sand, silt, and clay, and the percentages of each textures fall into classes where you
Great.
have.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
There was a question that got typed in about whether or not identifying those horizons are likely to be a part of the test, and based on photos, like those photos.
No, that's not the plan at this point.
Okay.
We
Okay.
certainly could do something like that.
Well,
But
that sounds
that-
exciting.
that's a very small part of the soil judging, which we aren't going to do because you can't texture or judge consistence or judge structure or anything of that nature off of a photo. So
Right. Yep.
we hadn't considered that. It's certainly something that may be possible. Nick has hundreds of pictures of soils with with measuring tapes next to him in his computer at the office. So certainly something that we could make available, but we did not have intention of doing that at this point.
Okay. Thanks.
You're welcome. And so back to texture. Anything over 2 millimeters is considered a rock fragment. So the sizes of the materials, the sand is the larger component and the clay is very small component. And when we say coarse soils, they are sandier. When we say fine soils, they tend to have more silt and clay. And there was a discussion in the video about the textural triangle. And the textural triangle is commonly a test question, so it's not overly complex, and it's a very good thing to learn. So there we are with a representation of the sand, silt, and clay for the differences in size. And there's the textural triangle. In Maine, generally, we have loam, silt loam, sandy loam soils are really the most common. We do have some loamy sands, some silty clay loams, but they're far less common than the first three that I mentioned. For soil structure, we have the 4 groups that we consider for the Envirothon test: platy, prismatic, blocky, and granular. There's others, but those are the ones that we emphasize for the main Envirothon test. The platy forms into plate-like structure, so it looks like a stack of plates almost. Prismatic looks like a prism or a column in the soil profile. Blocky and granular are the most common. Granular tends to be the finer clumps of soil at the surface, and the blocky tends to be the larger soil fragments or clumps that you wind up with in the B horizon. And water movement is heavily influenced by soil structure. Water can move fairly rapidly through a granular structure. It moves fairly slowly through a platy structure because it needs to go kind of over and through the plates, trying to find preferential flow paths. In this image, we also show massive, and massive is what you'll find in the sea horizon and the lodgement tills. And really, for most of the soils in Maine, they have a hard layer down below, so that would be slow water movement through that. Your prismatic structure is going to happen in your sediments primarily, and not very commonly in your tills. And blocky, as I mentioned, with the moderate flow, is common of the B horizon. The farmers who do a lot of tillage and the farmers that do the no-till, they're all looking for the granular formation of the soil structure, where if it's compacted, it can be massive. It can form massive where granular once existed. Soil consistence refers to how firm the soil is in place. And this is something that we have done in the soil judging pit, where you would take a butter knife and poke against and see how easily the soil would fall apart. In the hard pans, it's very firm. You really can't easily push a butter knife in and have any fallout. So that would be considered firm. In the lodgement tills and in the upper horizons, generally you have friable soils where you can get a soil structural unit to drop out. And loose is common in sands and not very common in other soils. The soil depth is your depth to bedrock. We've got the 4 classes that we recognize, and this is depth to bedrock. And so 0 to 20 inches is shallow, 20 to 40 inches is moderately deep, 40 to 60 inches is deep, and over 60 inches is very deep. There's also very shallow that's 0 to 10, but we don't recognize that for the Envirothon test. But you may find that listed in Web Soil Survey for certain soils. And in the picture, we have a potato field with very soft bedrock. And in fact, the bedrock comes in just about 28 inches there. And that darker material below is bedrock that has been excavated. So that soil there, for example, would classify as moderately deep. There are 7 soil drainage classes. The soil drainage classes are the depth of the seasonal high water table and how rapidly it drains. In Maine, we have a lot of poorly drained soils and a lot of somewhat poorly drained soils. Fair amount of moderately well-drained soils, but not a lot of well-drained, excessively drained, somewhat excessively drained. You will find them, but they're nowhere near as common as the first three that I mentioned. Soils that are high in clay tend to be poorly drained. They're impacted by the water table. A perched water table is water that is sitting above a compacted layer or bedrock layer, where an apparent water table is water moving up and down, fluctuating, usually within sand. The drier soils, the moderately well-drained soils have the yellows, reds, and browns, where the wetter soils, the poorly drained and very poorly drained, tend to have gray, green, or blue soil colors. And oftentimes we're judging water table based upon the presence of redoxymorphic features. So the redoxymorphic features are shown in the pictures here. And basically, it's a biogeochemical reaction that has occurred, which has reduced, in this case, the iron and manganese from the soil. And it went into soil solution, into soil water. Then when it dried up, it precipitated into the reddish areas. And the gray area right at the center of that is an area that has lost most of its iron. So, more pictures. We've got a very poorly drained soil in the upper left. We've got a redoxymorphic feature next to that. We've got a more redoxymorphic features in sand and an apparent water table in the upper right. In the lower left, we've got a deep, well-drained soil. In the second one over on the bottom, second one from left on the bottom, we have a moderately well-drained soil, and that picture is a picture of the state soil, which is Chusungcook. It's a lodgement till, and you can see the rocks within it. You can see an E horizon, a B horizon, and a C horizon with a small A horizon. We have similar conditions in the one in the bottom row, third over, which is appears to be a sediment. And then we have a very depleted soil in the lower right, where it has stayed wet and the biogeochemical reaction has occurred for so long that more than just the iron and the manganese, but almost anything that could be reduced was, and thus the reds form stronger and the grays form stronger. And that's evidence of long-term saturation from poor drainage. Soil reaction is soil pH. It's a scale of 1 to 14, where 7 is neutral, below 7 is acidic, and above 7 is alkaline. Most Maine soils tend to run acidic. A good topsoil will be somewhere in the 6s, but topsoils in the 5 are not all that uncommon. pH is mitigated by liming, which is why farmers lime the soil. Cation exchange capacity is the ability of the soil to hold nutrients. And so the organic matter and clay have the negative charges, and most of the desirable cations or nutrients that plants want are positive charges. So they stick to them like a magnet. And calcium, ammonium, and potassium are key among them. They affect soil fertility. Organic matter and clay are the best things at holding nutrients because they have a higher cation exchange capacity. So erosion, as it was mentioned in the video, can happen through many processes. In Maine, you have water, ice, gravity, and wind. The gravity, of course, is related to the water. Rainfall comes and detaches the soil particle, which we'll get into in a little more in depth in a minute. Will break loose the soil, cause it to go downhill, and be deposited, causing sedimentation in lower areas in the landscape. When you have a lot of erosion, it's considered accelerated erosion, and that's generally caused by anthropogenic activity and certainly by heavy rainfalls, which we've been having quite a few of the last few years. Harmful effects, the loss of the topsoil. Stream banks can erode, the roadways can erode, and the stream channels can fill with sediments. And the stream channels can also, when they're not only change the structure and the flow of the stream, but can also impact the wildlife within the stream. And again, all this information is in the soils document in great detail. Ponds can be impacted through filling, and the nutrients within the eroded soil can also affect the makeup of the lake, increasing ability for eutrophication through excessive nutrient addition. And the cost can be great, especially when it impacts human activity like road ditches and such. Causes larger maintenance costs. Anytime you direct water instead of allowing a natural effect of water, you're going to have issues with the water in the soil. Natural channels are not culverts. When you put water into a pipe, it tends to pick up in speed, and then you'll have accelerated erosion downslope. So the erosion processes for areas that are either not covered by vegetation, covered by weakly rooted vegetation, or areas where the vegetation can be overcome by too much water coming from upslope, causes erosion. It starts with raindrop erosion, which is detachment, goes on to sheet, rill and gully, and stream erosion. So as I mentioned, raindrop erosion is where the raindrop lands and dislodges soil particles, gets them into solution, gets them up and mobile, and then the additional rain will carry them off site. In a field, you'll wind up with sheet erosion, where the channels will cut from the additional water. The more water you get, the more it will gather together, find a preferential flow path, and cut. The channels will generally find the path of least resistance, so they generally aren't straight, but they are generally, in the most general sense, straight, but they're not straight like a man-made system. Rill and gully erosion tends to occur further down slope, and they are deeper cuts, and they generally will wash away whatever was the tilled layer and ride along the harder B and C horizons. You get concentrated flows downslope of the raindrop in the detachment. So here we are in a landscape. We've got the sheet erosion, the rill erosion, and then the classic gullies down below. So ideally you want the water to infiltrate. And so you've got factors that impact infiltration and permeability. Texture is a key one. Just in their natural state, Sands will allow infiltration much better than clay soils. And so you'll tend to have more runoff with silt and clays. And silt and clays also are more susceptible to detachment from raindrop erosion. And therefore, they're more likely to run off and erode. Silts are by far and away the most prone to erosion, where the clay particles are sticky and they stick together and are far less likely to be dislodged by the raindrops. Structure, again, we talked about how water moves through the void spaces. And so if you have granular structure, the water can infiltrate at least through the granular horizon, and then hopefully into a blocky horizon, and the soil's water holding capacity is increased. Where if you have soils that will block the water coming through, such as massive structure or platy structure, then you'll tend to have more runoff through those impermeable or partially impermeable layers. Topography and watershed size are key components. The steeper the site, the faster the water is going to move and the more erosion you're going to have. And the larger the hill, with the more watershed upslope, the more erosion potential you're going to have. So controlling erosion on development sites is important. Development sites tend to have the vegetation stripped off to facilitate smoothing and leveling and putting up buildings and parking lots and such. However, the soil is in a very vulnerable position when you have a development site. So proper planning of what you're going to do to minimize the impact of impact and duration of the soil being vulnerable. You're going to try and avoid water from upslope coming into a development site so that you don't have a lot of fast moving water that will cause additional erosion. And diversion ditches and silt fences are commonly used. There's other temporary erosion and sediment control measures that can be used as well, like staked hay bales, mulch. They have silt socks and various things of that nature, which are intended to slow down the flow or retain the material on site. You always want to disturb as small of an area as possible. Maintain the erosion control devices. If you do have a heavy rain event and they get full, you want to make sure that they are in good use and cleaned up and ready for another storm up to capacity. Permanent erosion control measures are required generally in development sites to begin with, but they include seeding down and trying to get some vegetation onto the site, make things more stable, and then maintaining the permanent erosion control measures is very important. So finally, we're on to soil survey information, and we've talked about Web Soil Survey already. The address is listed there. Web Soil Survey has replaced the traditional county soil survey book. It can tell you it will provide a map of what soils are on the site and what their suitabilities and limitations are for those soils. Soil survey information is not overly detailed because of the scale that the survey was required to be at. So if you have a soil, if it tells you that you have the state soil of Chesuncook in this area, within that area there will be included areas of similar soils and sometimes slightly different soils, but it's not 100% that it's going to be that soil type on every inch of a soil map unit. We have over 100 different soil series in Maine. They differentiate from the soil forming factors textures, drainage, all of those such things. On the map, you have soil map units, which are the delineations of the soil series or combination of soil series in agricultural situations or in urban areas. We tend to have higher intensity of the soil survey, so you will have generally one soil series listed in the map unit name. If you get into the woods or the less populated areas, you'll wind up with generally 2 or 3 soils in a association or a complex comprising in the map unit. Soils are based on the Katina concept, which soils of similar properties are occurring on a common landform. So in this image here, right in the center, you see Monson on the top. Monson is a shallow soil with 10 to 20 inches to bedrock. So you tend to be shallower up on top of the landscape. Then you transition into Elliotsville, which is 20 to 40 inches to bedrock, moderately deep. Then you get into deep soils like Chesuncook and Telos and down into Monarda and Burnham. So your drainage of your Monson and your Elliotsville are going to be well and moderately well. Chesuncook is moderately well. Telos is somewhat poorly. Monarda is poorly, and Burnham is very poorly. As you can see, as you go down the landscape, there's going to be more and more water accumulates. Also within the Katina concept, you can see on the side where it says dense glacial till, that's your parent material. And below that is the bedrock that the material is most likely weathered from. So that's where they come up with the map units and how they try and lay them out on the landscape in the 3D profile. So the soil interpretations are from Web Soil Survey. As I mentioned before, this is part of the test, and this is what we will provide you in the test is several soil map units with their general soil descriptions. And from within that, we will ask questions, multiple choice, and you can see one up in the corner. The first one is, which soil meets hydrate criteria? And if you look through, you have Beckett, Hollis, Monadnock, Adams, and Ridgebury. And if you go down to the bottom one in the list there, it says map unit Ridgebury, RBA, Ridgebury Fine Sandy Loam. And you look about halfway down the paragraph and you can see it's on the third line. The natural drainage class is poorly drained. So this is more or less open book. It takes reading the material that's provided to you on hand, but it's really testing the ability to look at a soil interpretation and glean information from it. We aren't going to do the soil judging, but if we did, we would look at, as I mentioned, color, texture, structure, depth of bedrock, slope of the land, surface stoniness, drainage class, and parent material. We hope to do them again in the future. Here's an example of the soil judging scorecard that we would use, where we have presence and absence, the color, the texture, the structure. All this stuff's got to be mentioned in the soils document. However, we will not be testing on this year. We've got the 5 colors that we recognize. As it was mentioned in the video, soil scientists generally use color books. For the simplicity of the Envirothon event, we make it with just general colors. We would judge the soil texture based upon, rather than all the classes in the textural triangle, we use the 3, clay, sandy, or loamy. We would look at 4 structural classes that we've talked about before. soil depth, which we've already covered, slope of the land with the clinometer, and we try and stick with the classes that are common in soil survey, where it's 0 to 3%, 3 to 8, 8 to 15, and above 15 for the test. Surface stoniness is influenced by parent material, and you can see a few different cases here. We have very stony in the upper two, which would be very difficult to farm that land for annually tilled crops because of the stones. We have slightly stony in the lower left, which is a few stones but not an impediment to farming. And then we have no stones or stone free in the lower right. For drainage class, for the purposes of the judging scorecard, we would look at well-drained, moderately well-drained, and poorly drained. And we're basically going by the colors on those three. For the soil parent materials that we would test, we stick with glacial till. We don't worry about lodgement versus ablation for the soil judging scorecard. Sediments, we don't worry about marine versus lacustrine. Outwash, organic, and alluvial. And that is pretty much the soils document in a PowerPoint. Are there any questions?
Thank you, Greg. So far, no new questions have been added to the chat, but at this time, if teams or advisors want to unmute themselves and just ask the questions directly, go ahead.
Well, it looks like I did a good job then, or I confused everybody.
This is Carol, and I just have one really quick question.
Sure.
So would the potential question appear like a scenario, like, the aquaculture company is coming in to build a land-based farm on, such and such 5 acres or whatever, and would they be given, something like that, or is it going to be just pretty cut and dry, like this is what the conditions are of this particular farm, and maybe some recommendations that the students would have to make regarding how that land could be utilized, something along those lines?
No, there won't be any questions of that type this year.
Okay.
That's really traditionally the state exam. We would have a section like that on the state exam. However, we don't have anything like that in this year's test. And for that case, we had a packet with that information that was provided.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
This is Dale. I think the objective with this year's virtual test is to make sure that any resource materials you need to answer the question are part of the test. So they are readily available, and it's not a case where you would need to be looking in another resource or in an alternative interpretation. So that's sort of the objective of putting the tests together this year. It will not be the case in the future, but given the virtual nature, that is the plan. And then as Greg mentioned earlier, the fact that the soil pit information, you're not going to be able to use taste or texture or the rest. You're going to need to be told any of those characteristics in order to make a judgment call on your question.
Yeah, the only thing that we would have had that would have been at all similar to the question that was asked would be the soils interpretations, and it was very much just like the example that I showed in the PowerPoint, where you've got 5 or 6 different soil map unit descriptions and multiple choice questions based upon that. All you have to do is look at it, hunt for the relevant information, and make an answer.
Craig, are there any other, or Nick, are there any other resources that you know of out there that you would like to point the teams and advisors to in terms of like great study materials or resources? Because that YouTube video you showed was great.
Sure, I think that's pretty much what we would want to direct people to, but anybody who gets the motivation to feed the black flies, grab a shovel and go out and dig a small hole, it really helps you relate what you're seeing in the printed material.
All right, last call for questions today. All right, well, thank you, Greg, and thank you, Nick, for your time and your expertise. We will get this information out to the teams shortly, and hopefully you'll have some time to study everything and do one last review before the exams that will be starting on May 18th. So thank you again, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.